Yo, what's up everyone? My name is Yura and we are here today with something brand new. Today we are taking a look at Konami's brand new way to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesis format. So for any of you that are familiar with me, I have not played modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In quite a long time. It's been probably about a year, if not close to that. And instead I have been playing a lot of Meadowlands and Rush Duel and Alestrals and some other jank card games on the side that I just haven't really talked about on any platform because I just play things on my own time sometimes. But modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always had a soft spot in my heart. It is something that I truly do adore. It is the game that really kickstarted my love of TCGs, and I've been missing it to a certain extent, and I just never really have had a reason to try to get back into Advanced, be it deck prices or not having a consistent locals near me, or many of the other reasons that could potentially cause me to not want to play Advanced Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesis is where this kind of differs. It kind of solves a lot of the issues that I was having with Advanced. And not that there's anything wrong with the Advanced format. I know people enjoy it just well enough. It's just not really something for me. But Genesis is, for those that are unfamiliar, a different take on Advanced. It uses the modern card pool, but with the rule set of how the game functioned before pendulums were introduced, which means there are no pendulums or link monsters or an extra monster zone. And instead of just having like a separate ban list that they have to keep up, they kind of have that in the point system, rather the Genesis point system. So the way this format functions is that there is a list of cards called the pointed list. Certain generics and powerful engine cards live on this list to kind of keep the power level of the format in check. You can't really just come into this format with a slew of the 20-something good generics from Advanced and then just fit in whatever engine you choose to play. And the main reason for that is because most of the good generics in this format are on the pointed list. You can see here Ash Blossom is 15 apiece, and you only have 100 to work with by the default. So for a deck like this, where we're spending half of our point pool on Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, we kind of have to make concessions on the rest of the good generic that we're allowed to play. We can't play Imperm because it's at 13. We can play Valor, which is at 7, and 2 Ghost Bell, which is at 5. But the only reason we can really do this is because we have to make concessions in the extra deck as well, because there are a lot of really powerful extra deck monsters that are also living on the pointed list. For example, I've used 20 of my points on Utopic Draco Future here, and these are the kind of concessions that you have to make when you're thinking about building decks for this format, and I love it. It is super, super interesting. That said, I do want to talk about the actual deck that you see on your screen here a little bit, and it's Springans. There are a couple of decks that I want to go over as just like my first introduction to this format, because while none of these are going to be a fully fleshed out deck profile, I kind of just want to yap about the decks that I'm excited to play. I do think the way that you go about building these decks for this format is different than Advanced, and I think it's very interesting. So Springans in this format is actually pretty similar to the way things work in Advanced, because there are no pointed cards in engine. Notably, because this format works off of a pointed list as opposed to a ban list, there are a lot of really old cards that are just like available for play now. Things like Mirage of Nightmare is like 10 points, Pot of Greed is around, Graceful Charity is around. You can play literally any card that has ever been released. That said, some really like terribly designed cards are kind of sitting at the 100 point value. So if you want to play a one of for a Nightmare card, you're free to do so, but like I wouldn't recommend it personally. When I go about building decks for this format, I have really been taking a shine to taking a deck that does not have any engine requirements on the pointed list and then filling it out with some interesting extra deck monsters or some powerful generics. Case in point with Springans. This is a deck that can function pretty well enough on its own, and it's genuinely just a lot of fun because Tally-Ho Springans is one of the coolest cards ever. It is so much fun to resolve, and I will literally never get tired of using it. But also, because all of like the good hand traps are pointed, this is kind of more in favor of a board breaker format, where we're playing things like Ultimate Slayer, Kurikara Divicarnate, Dark Ruler No More is really, really solid. A lot of the good board breakers in this format do not live on the pointed list. You can even make concessions and play like the bootleg versions of Raigeki in Special Hurricane and Lightning Vortex. There's a lot to be thought about when building decks for this format, and I don't know what it is. It just does something to my brain. Something about having to work within certain restrictions as opposed to just having like the entire card pool at your disposal is really interesting. I like these kind of deck building challenges. I think they're super sick, but I don't want to get stuck on one deck for too long because I'm going to do fully fleshed out deck profiles for these decks a little later on, and Spring Ends is absolutely going to be one of them. This is probably going to be the first one that I talk about at length because God, I love it so much. I don't mean to stay on here for too long, but like the Therions not being on the pointed list is really sick for this deck particular because Gigantic Champion Sargas is also not on the pointed list, and also the way that this deck interacts with like the good generic pool of cards in the extra deck is really interesting. Like, for example, there are no links in this format, so most of the powerful generic endboard staples are Xyz monsters. So something like Gigantic Champion Sargas or even regular Captain Sargas work really, really well when you pair them with typical endboard pieces like Time Thief Redoer or Tornado Dragon. Oh God, I cannot get enough of this deck. I've played it a couple of times and it's just so much damn fun. I love it so much. I've actually got this deck coming in paper and I cannot wait to bring it to locals. It's got me so excited. But I do want to talk about two other decks today because I think they are really interesting in regards to this format. And I think they are built a little differently when it comes to this format as opposed to like this deck, which is functionally just advanced Spring Ends that has to make some concessions in terms of like what non-engine it can use. The next deck I want to talk about is Ashened, and this is a deck that is so unbelievably terrible in advanced. It is maybe one of the worst, if not the worst, TCG exclusive archetype ever released. And that sucks because I think like visually it's one of the most interesting archetypes in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! I know people call it like Dark Souls archetype, and it kind of is the Dark Souls archetype, but I think it's genuinely so sick looking. But this deck is full of a slew of problems that just unfortunately make it pretty much impossible to play in advanced. However, in Genesys, these problems aren't so apparent. Namely, one of the big problems is this deck loses really hard to like non-engine interaction. And because a lot of those non-engine pieces are pointed now, the deck just kind of has an easier time because it doesn't have to play through as much. This deck also works really well because it has its own slew of archetypal board breakers in like Ashen to Endlessness, which is a searchable trap card super polymerization, and also the deck just kind of gets to play regular super polymerization. But also, one of the big benefits that this deck has in this format is there are no link monsters, which means your Vados that you summon to your opponent's field can't just be immediately linked away, so it's no longer a problem for your opponent, which turns off a lot of your opponent's turn interaction. Vados in general, I think, is just a really interesting generic in this format, even outside of Ashen, because it countering field spell decks is maybe actually really important when potentially the best deck in the room is Odeon, which I will talk about next. That deck is super sick, but it does kind of rely on field spells. Alongside a lot of decks in this format, you can see even like Spring Ends has a reliance on it. But much like Spring Ends, this deck does not have any in-engine pointed cards. And I also don't think it will really ever get any because the engine cards for this deck are they're not great. They're really like, it's Ashen at the end of the day, right? Like the deck still has problems. And if you do run into a handful of non-engine, the deck will still probably suffer a little bit, but I do genuinely think in a format where board breakers are kind of like the way to play, this deck has some really interesting pieces of it. Also, notably, one of the better side deck cards that I've seen come up is Flying Sea, and this deck does really not need its Xyz monsters. Like, they exist, they're cool, they do some really neat things. Like the rank 9 pool in this format is actually really sick, but you don't need it. You can just super poly away your opponent's entire board and make the Fusion Vados. This card's sick as hell. But this is one of those examples of decks that I feel like never really had a chance to shine in an advanced, but it does have a chance to shine in Genesys just because of the way the rulings differ. And by that, I mean just like the rule set is different. Like there's no pendulums, no links, and generally the power level is lower in terms of generics. Like you're not going to have to worry about running into 4 hand traps and a 1-card starter in this format. Not really. There are some decks that are still like definitely really, really good, but they've had to make concessions in their own lists as well. And one of the really interesting points of this format that I think is cool to bring up is as you see your opponent play their deck, you can kind of get a feel for what they spent their points on, and it leaves you to play around it going forward. Like, if you see 100 points worth of cards in your opponent's main deck game 1, they're probably not going to be siding into anything that's on the pointed list, things like Droll and Lockbird, or like the Dominus cards, or anything else that would live on that pointed list that would also find its way into the side deck. And I think that is really, really interesting. That's such a neat little side thing to be playing around. It's such a more interesting minigame than, oh, does my opponent have Maxi like in Master Duel? That is a minigame that I'm super down for. That's super cool. All this said, though, I am super excited to play Ashen. I have also these cards coming in the mail, and I cannot wait to get my hands on them. I'm really excited to bring this deck to locals because I think genuinely, like, it's going to be the first time that I get to actually play this deck in a setting where it's not immediately dead on arrival, and that is so exciting to me. I do have one more deck that I want to talk about today, just to kind of like give my first impressions on the format, and it is probably going to be one of the best decks in the room, if I'm going to be honest. So, Odeon. This is a deck that I mentioned before, and it is probably going to end up being the best deck in the room, if not one of the best decks in the room, post like VS-K9 getting hit. By the way, that was super cool. Konami realized pretty much immediately that VS-K9 got ported to this format with functionally no important hits, except they were missing the rock. But like, they hit it immediately, which was really, really cool. And now here we are floundering about to find what the next best deck in the room is, and Odeon is actually looking really, really powerful. This is a deck, much like Ashen and Springans, that I never really got the chance to play because it just kind of came out at a point in time where I wasn't playing Advanced. Odeon, however, differs in the fact that it plays around with a funny gimmick, and that is trap monsters. I am a sucker for gimmicks. You can really see this when I'm trying to play counter-based decks in Meadowlands, things like aliens and stuff. I just love to no end. And trap monsters are potentially one of my favorite gimmicks in the entirety of Yu-Gi-Oh! I think they're so interesting, and I am kind of a sucker for Battle City. I love Odeon, and like the way that this deck functions, I think is super cool. I love the visual style of these cards. Anubis the Last Judge has one of my favorite artworks in the entire game. I think it looks absolutely ridiculous. But this deck, much like a lot of the other decks in the format, has to make its own concessions when figuring out what generics to play. And while this deck does not have any pointed cards yet, I would be very surprised if it does not see some kind of point limit in the future. For now, though, we get to pretty safely play things like Dominus Purge, Solemn Strike, Book of Eclipse is a really solid board breaker. We get to play Fuelos because it's only at 7, but none of the Odeon cards specifically are on the pointed list, and these cards all on their own with just Engine are really, really good. They're really solid interaction. They pair super nicely with Statue of the Anguish pattern for even more interruption. The field spell, Treasures of the Kings, is really sick. Man with the Mark is kind of an ass to out, and Anubis the Last Judge is just an incredible card through and through. And much like Ashen, this deck also doesn't super need its Xyz monsters because you can instead just play around with your fusion, Divine Serpent Apophis, which means it's not super weak to things like Flying Sea. And also, this list doesn't have Azurune in it. It should. I just forgot. My bad. This isn't meant to be like a full deck list. It's not final. None of these are final. They're still going to see more adjustments as I like mess around with the format more. But in place of Silhouette Rabbit, we are playing Sudden Thunder Swamp, which is a card that I am convinced exists because Konami knew Genesys was coming. That is probably just like a random crackpot theory that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't line up with card releases at all. But like, to me, it makes sense. Sudden Thunder Swamp is a method with which you have to get access to your other continuous traps, which without Silhouette Rabbit, we wouldn't really have access to. So I think there's just a lot of cool things in this format. Like, while we might not be playing the crazy cards like Pot of Greed or like Graceful Charity or Sitting Under Mystic Mine, I will never be doing that. If you catch me doing that, I'm a doppelganger. You should kill me. But I think this is all part of making a really interesting format. Having to make these kinds of concessions as opposed to where advanced building, you can kind of do whatever you want outside of just like summon locks and whatnot. This format has deck building restrictions that are super interesting to build around, and I genuinely cannot get enough of it. So that's really it for me today. I didn't want to dive too deep into any of these because I want to do full deck profiles on these sometime down the line once I get more familiar with the format, because I have been out of Advanced again for a very long time, and it's going to take a while to shake the rust off. So for right now, I want to thank you all so much for stopping by and checking out the video. If you like me, or if you want to see more stuff for Genesys in the future, or just maybe you want to check out Meadowlands, the Time Wizard format that I keep parading around because I love it so dearly, please do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. I know I hate asking for it. I've never really done it before because it just feels gross. But like with the restricted mode thing that YouTube's doing and the algorithm changes, it's kind of necessary to do. So I would really appreciate it. It would mean a lot to me. But again, thank you all so much for sticking around to the end of the video, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.